every Championship manager ranked from worst to best based on this season. Let's go. Guys, welcome back to another video on the channel. I always enjoy doing this one at the end of each season. I want to get your guys' thoughts on this one in the comments down below. We're going to be going through every Championship manager this season and placing them into the following tier list. So a manager was either useless, poor, average, good, very good, or elite. Managers from your club this season, where would you personally place them in the tier list? As always, if you do going to enjoy, make sure to leave a like. 300 likes would be massively appreciated. But without any further ado, let's go. Let's start out with Nottingham Forest Sabri Lamucci. Now, he was only given 4 games in charge of Forest this season until he ultimately was sacked by the club. He couldn't turn around the poor form which had manifested from their playoff collapse last season. And he's a tough one to put into this tier list because he wasn't given all too much time, but I'm probably going to have to throw him into that poor category. Shame for how things ended up finishing for Lamucci because the early signs under him were quite promising. Next up then to Sheffield Wednesday's Gary Monk, the first Sheffield Wednesday manager and certainly not the last that we're going to have on today's video. Now, I'd probably throw him into a similar category. Not the worst manager that Wednesday have had this season in terms of points per game and that sort of thing. Ultimately, he lost his job early on in November when it looked like Wednesday wouldn't be able to overcome that point deficit that they started the season out with. They lost 4 consecutive matches, which was a real sort of hammer blow near the start of the season. So yeah, I'd probably chuck Gary Monk into poor. Speaking of Sheffield Wednesday managers though, we'll go to Tony Pulis next, who, to be honest with you, I think I'm going to have to throw into that useless category. He was in charge for 10 matches, he won just 1 of them, so a 10% win record is absolutely abysmal. And I know he came in really difficult circumstances, but there was the feeling that Pulis, being this sort of relegation master, you know, always being able to get teams up for it and going and stuff like that, none of that really materialised at Sheffield Wednesday. It wasn't a great fit, so yeah, I'm going to have to throw into that useless category based on this season. Cardiff's Neil Harris up next. Now, based on last season, Neil Harris would have been right up there in the tier list. You know, he came in and sort of galvanised that Cardiff squad, was able to make the playoffs with them, but in terms of this season, really poor on his end. That Cardiff had arguably like one of the best squads in the Championship in terms of some of the individuals that were there. You know, the Kiefer Moores, the Harry Wilsons. It was a squad who had previously made it into the playoffs. Ultimately, when he lost his job, Cardiff was sat 15th in the Championship, which was a vast underachievement. So for me, Neil Harris this season, I'd say poor. Next up then, we'll go to Birmingham's Aitor Karanka. Now, he really let me down this season because I had quite high hopes for Karanka at Birmingham. I thought that it might actually be a decent fit. On paper, Birmingham had a pretty decent squad for me coming into this season, and I mean, Karanka can't complain that he wasn't given enough time at Birmingham because they certainly persisted with him at times when there was immense pressure on him. I think that if Birmingham had stuck with Karanka for the season and they didn't bring in Bowyer when they did, there's a high possibility that they would have gone down this season. So for me, Aitor Karanka this season, pretty useless. Derby's Philip Koku comes in next, another manager who was pretty dismal this season, to be honest with you. There were quite a few managers who lost their job in November, and Philip Koku was another victim to that month. He left Derby when they were sat bottom of the Championship. Really abysmal start to the season for them, and based on this season, with the expectations they had going into this season, I've got to say Philip Koku was pretty useless. Next up then, maybe to a bit of a controversial one, we'll go for Watford's Vladimir Ivic. Now, he's a tough one to place into this tier list because obviously Watford had incredibly high expectations, and rightly so, going into this season. Obviously they ultimately went on to make the top 2, but where would I place Ivic onto this tier list? When he was sacked by Watford, they were sat 5th in the Championship, so by no means had the season up until that point been an absolute disaster, but Watford had just been a bit uninspiring really, hadn't they? It was very sort of regimented defensive football they were playing. Honestly, I think I'd throw Ivic into the average category. I don't think Watford were a shambles under him, but they certainly weren't meeting their expectations, were they? So for Ivic, I'd throw him into the average tier. Next up then to Bristol City's Dean Holden. Now, he actually started out the season fairly well. Bristol City won their first 4 matches of the season, but when things started to go wrong, it didn't look like Dean Holden had it in him to turn the ship around at Bristol City. Neither does Nigel Pearson, to be fair to him, but we'll get into him in a second. He ultimately lost his job in February of this season. He lost 9 of his last 12 matches in charge for Bristol City. I'd throw him into the poor category, I think. Bournemouth's Jason Tindall up next, and he's a bit of an awkward one to judge really, isn't he? Because listen, Bournemouth started out the season fantastically well. I think that going into the new year they were 2nd in the Championship. He's another one of those managers that when things started to go wrong for him this season, he didn't look like he had that sort of backup plan to turn things around. It looked like Bournemouth may even have gone ahead and missed out on the top 6. It's a tough one. Overall, I'd put him in average because there were some very good performances in and around the start of the year, but when things went wrong, we weren't sure if he was the man that was going to turn things around. Next up, let's go for North End's Alex Neil, because this has been a season to forget for him. Obviously, lost his job towards the end of the season when our form had been pretty shoddy throughout the year, to be honest with you. I think he lost 10 of his last 15 matches in charge of North End. The way we started out the season wasn't ideal, with our home form being absolutely dismal. There were just a few sort of like sprinklings of performances here and there that we thought, oh my god, Alex Neil's still got it, you know, thinking back to like Brentford away, Bournemouth away, a lot of away performances around the start of the season. But when things went wrong for Neil, and they certainly did, especially in the second half of the season, he looked like a bit of a lost man, to be honest with you. By the standards that he had to set himself, it was, you know, quite a poor season on reflection. Obviously, I still stand by, he didn't have it easy. You know, his best players were sold in January, and he was always going to find it tough to sort of claw something back. But from what we've seen, Frankie McAvoy has been able to get out of these players since Alex Neil's left. I think it has to go down as a poor season for Alex Neil. I do think he'll be back in the Championship, and he'll be a good manager in the Championship, but things just ended a little bit sour at Preston, didn't they? Next up, let's go for Stoke City's Michael O'Neill. Now, a 14th finish for this Stoke squad in the Championship, who were expected to be in and amongst the playoffs this season, is really quite poor. And I do accept that injuries have played their part in Stoke's season. You know, they started out fairly brightly, and had they not got those injuries when they did, who knows, it could have been a different story for them. But overall, on reflection, I'd say average at best for O'Neill this season. It's not been a very inspiring year for Stoke this time round. Huddersfield's Carlos Corbran, he has been an interesting manager, I think it's fair to say, in his first season in Championship football. Now, no Championship side has conceded more goals than Huddersfield this season. 71 goals they let in. They've been an incredibly open side as the season's gone on. I understand the philosophy there and what he's trying to get going for Huddersfield, and at times there have been some really nice performances from them, especially in an attacking sense, you know, building up the ball, going from back to front. However, sometimes you need to be a little bit more adaptable to the players that you've actually got at your disposal, and at times I think that that's probably gone against him. So in his first season, a 20th finish for Huddersfield, he's not been great. I'd say poor overall. A lot of negativity on the video so far, so let's go for a decent one next up. We'll go for Cardiff's Mick McCarthy. Obviously, he took over the reins after Neil Harris lost his job. Initially had this unbelievable unbeaten run. It looked like Cardiff may go ahead and sneak into the playoffs. In the end, they just felt a little bit short, but I'm optimistic about what Cardiff could do if McCarthy's given sort of free reins next season. You know, a full pre-season under his belt, he gets to be a little bit more involved with the recruitment, and a full season under him. I think that Cardiff will be there or thereabouts. It'll be the tough side to beat under him so far, and overall, I'd say he's been a good manager this season. And let's go for another good manager up next. Let's go for Wickham's Gareth Ainsworth. Now, despite them being relegated, I can't think of any other manager that would have got more from this Wickham squad this season than Gareth Ainsworth has been able to. You know, he's battling with considerably the lowest budget in the Championship, and for them to come within a hair's whisker of survival this season, I think still deserves a lot of praise. I think that a lot of people are with me in thinking the same there. I think that his stock obviously is really high at the moment. It'll be interesting to see if he does, you know, stick with Wickham for the rebuild. Obviously, the Preston job is no longer available, which he was being linked to previously. But yeah, overall, I'd say Ainsworth has been a good manager this season. Maybe a very good one. Let's go for a very good manager next up, though, and I'm going to throw Mark Robbins into that category. I think that the way that Coventry have ended up being so comfortable in survival in the end, I think that a lot of people predicted Coventry to be the best performing of the newly promoted sides. I think a lot of us did predict them to survive, but for them to finish 16th in their first season back up in the Championship, I think deserves a lot of respect. I think there was a time especially where they weren't winning a lot of matches, where it looked like, okay, Coventry might be in a little bit of trouble here. But then when the pressure was on, they clicked back up into gear, and I think that Robbins deserves a lot of credit for that. So yeah, for me, I'd put him in as a very good manager this season. And along a similar vein to that, Nathan Jones at Luton Town. For him to have that side 12th in the Championship deserves an absolute load of respect. Last season was, I mean, it was a bit of a miraculous run that they went on towards the end of the season to achieve survival in the first place under Nathan Jones, but he's been able to take that form from last season and completely run with it. The fact that none of us have been speaking about Luton in this relegation battle for the majority of the season deserves a lot of respect. So for me, I'd say he's also been a very good manager this season. And you know what? I also think that Zisco gets his name into that category as well. The way that he was able to take on that Watford squad, which was looking a bit drained of energy, to be honest with you, a little bit lethargic and stuff like that from being under Ivic. He gave them a bit more of a licence to get forward, obviously guided them to second in the Championship in the end. Don't get me wrong, he's worked with an incredibly talented squad, you know, one of the best we've seen in the Championship over recent years, but it still takes a certain manager to get the best out of those players, and from the position that he took them over from to the position that they ended up in, you know, getting back to the Premier League at the first time of asking, deserves a lot of respect, and for a pretty inexperienced manager as well, I'd say he's been very good for Watford this season. Middlesbrough's Neil Warnock, I mean, this season for Borough overall has certainly been an improvement on last season's 17th finish. They finished in the top 10 this time round. At one point it looked like they may go ahead and sneak into the playoffs, but a bit of a dodgy run towards the end of the season when they went 5 games without a win ultimately meant that they fell shy in the end. But yeah, much improved from Borough this season. Warnock, I'd say he's been a good manager. Next up, let's go for Reading's Veljko Paunovic, because he's been a really interesting addition to the Championship so far. Now, if you were to tell me at the start of the season that Reading will go on to finish 7th in the Championship, I'd say, fair play, that manager's obviously done a very good job, and Paunovic has done just that at Reading. You know, at times, especially at the start of the season, they were playing some wonderfully clinical football, you know, the amount of goals that João was scoring, the link up with, you know, Ajari and Elise as well. It was brilliant stuff to watch. However, Reading were in the top 6 for the whole of the season up until April, and the fact that they then went winless in their last 6 Championship matches and ultimately missed out on the top 6 ultimately meant that their season ended in a little bit of disappointment in the end, didn't it? You know, you reassess your aims as the season's gone on, and halfway through, the aim for Reading was definitely to be finishing in the top 6. So overall, I'd say he's had a good season for Reading. It could have been very good if they did make the top 6 like they maybe should have. Next up, let's go for Swansea's Steve Cooper. Back-to-back top 6 finishes for him and Swansea, which I think is really positive, and the fact as well that Swansea aren't a team who throws around the money like a couple of other sort of parachute teams that we see coming down from the Premier League. Swansea are quite shrewd with the business that they do. They've used the loan market quite well once again this season, like they had done last time, albeit Swansea I'd say sort of like the most entertaining sides to watch. They play effective football, they get the results, and they've got their chance of playing in the Premier League next season. So Steve Cooper, I'd say he's done a very good job again at Swansea. Next up, let's go for Nottingham Forest Chris Hewton, who has been given a large chunk of this season for Forest. He took over on the 6th of October. Now, he took over Forest in quite a difficult situation. You know, they started out the season absolutely awfully under Sabri Lamucci, and ultimately he's been able to guide them to a pretty comfortable finish in the end. You know, towards the final few weeks of the season, Forest were never in contention for relegation. The football that they played at times hasn't exactly been the most thrilling and inspiring, I think it's fair to say, and come next season, Forest are definitely going to have a lot loftier ambitions, and I think that rightly so. But for this season, Chris Hewton, he's been alright, hasn't he? I'd say average to good for Chris Hewton. Now this next one's bound to get a lot of people talking in the comments down below. Wayne Rooney, what category would you place Rooney into this season? Because his season has sort of been split into 2, if that makes sense. When he initially took over the reins from Philip Koku, Derby were obviously in an awful position. You know, they were sat bottom of the Championship, and it was a side that was void of confidence. And there was one time in the season where Rooney looked like he got it spot on. I think it was around that January period. Derby went on a bit of a winning streak, and it looked like they may, you know, absolutely pull clear of relegation. And at that point, you know, a lot of people were singing the praises of Wayne Rooney. But the way that Derby finished the season, and I know that they avoided relegation in the end, but they won one of their last 15 matches, and I think that they can count themselves as really quite fortunate that none of the teams below them in the end ended up capitalising on the poor run of form that Derby went on towards the end of this season, because in any other typical Championship season, I think that Derby probably would have gone down. You know, they were absolutely awful towards the end of the season, weren't they? But he did do his job. You know, his job was ultimately at the start of the season to keep this Derby squad up. Honestly, with the way that Derby finished the season, I'd chuck Rooney into the poor category. Let me know down below where you yourselves would have him. Birmingham's Lee Bowyer walks into one of the top categories for me. Birmingham were in an absolute state at the time when Ayata Karanka departed. I remember doing a video on it actually saying, you know, Birmingham the laughing stock of the Championship, because at that point they certainly were. However, the immediacy of the impact that Lee Bowyer was able to have at this Birmingham squad was absolutely phenomenal. You know, at that point I was sure that they were going to go down. You know, Rotherham had the games in hand on them at that point, and Birmingham couldn't buy a win from absolutely anywhere. They weren't scoring goals, and they were shipping far too many. However, 5 wins from the 10 games that he was in charge for. They were safe with quite a few games to go this season as well. Massive praise needs to go for Lee Bowyer this season. He's been a very good manager. Next up, let's go for Norwich City's Daniel Farke, who's had an absolutely wonderful year with this Norwich squad in the Championship once again, and Norwich have been rewarded for their loyalty to their manager and their original plan. They've been top of the Championship since November, all the way throughout the rest of the season, and have been pretty much head and shoulders above everyone else in this league for the majority of the season, I think it's fair to say. Some of the football they've been playing at times has been absolutely scintillating stuff. The link up between the Emi Buendias, the team of Pukis, the Todd Cantwells as well. And I know that there's an abundance of quality within this Norwich squad, but like we were mentioning before, it still takes a certain manager to get the best out of these players, and Farke hasn't let up on them this season. Complacency never sort of seeped into this Norwich squad. It's a hungry team who wants to have their crack at the Premier League again, and he's more than deserved that this season. For me, elite manager this season. Next up, let's go for QPR's Mark Warburton, because he's had a really interesting year along with QPR. I think that it's best to sort of split this one in half really, because judging Warburton and QPR based on the first half of the season, I'd probably throw him into that poor category, but based off the second half of this season, I'd probably throw him into that very good category. So I've sort of come somewhere in the middle at the moment, and I've got him around good. But I think it's been a testament to QPR for actually sticking with him in a difficult period of this season when I think a lot of clubs maybe would have parted ways. You know, it wasn't particularly a great start they had under him this season. You know, they only won 1 of their first 8 matches. They had a run as well coming into the new year where I think they went 8 games without a win, and they were flirting with the idea of being dragged into a bit of a relegation battle. But I mean, we've spoken about it a lot on the channel this season, you know, the impact of some of the new additions that they had coming in January. But Wolves also deserves a lot of praise for how he's bedded all these players into this new side. And so yeah, I've got him in good overall, but I mean, based on that second half of the season, you'd probably have him in very good, wouldn't you? Millwall's Gareth Rowett, yeah, it's been an alright season for him, hasn't it? It's been a bit of a standard Millwall season. They started out a little bit rocky, but picked themselves up towards the second end of the season. I know they got hammered on the final day, but nevertheless, they definitely ended the season a lot stronger than they started out with. I'd say he's had a decent year. I'd throw him into the good sort of category, although next season I would like to see Millwall pushing on a little bit more for the top 6. Sheffield Wednesday's Darren Moore up next. He's an interesting one because ultimately, you know, Wednesday did go down. Moore was in charge for 14 matches, only winning 3 of them, but there were more positive signs under Darren Moore in terms of shots per game and stuff like that. Sheffield Wednesday did pick up in an attacking output sense. I think that the one game that most people will probably go back to was probably his first game in charge, actually, when they lost in the final seconds of that one against Rotherham. Inconsistency's been the problem for Wednesday all season. I'd probably throw Darren Moore into that average category. I'm looking forward to seeing how he goes ahead and tries to rebuild this Wednesday squad going into next season. Preston North End's Frankie McAvoy up next, and you have to say, I think he's done a very good job. You know, given some of the opposition that we faced when he came in, you know, he was instantly faced with the 3 games of Norwich, Swansea and Brentford. The fact that he's only lost 1 game since being appointed as a sort of interim manager, now he's been given the job on a full-time basis, I think he deserves a lot of praise. It was a very negative camp towards the end of the Alex Neil tenure, you know, for whatever reason people didn't seem very happy at the club. And so I do think that Frankie deserves a lot of praise, and I think that has done everything in his power to probably deserve the job heading into next season. So based on this season in isolation, I think he's done a very good job. Rotherham United's Paul Warne up next. I'm interested to see where you guys would personally place Paul Warne, because at times Rotherham showed that they could be a really competitive team in the Championship. Obviously circumstances sort of went against them in a way towards the end of the season with the hectic schedule they had, but the fact that they didn't win any of their last 7 matches and technically picked up the fewest amounts of points in the Championship this season, because obviously Sheffield Wednesday had that point deduction. I like him as a person, but managerially I probably have to put it down as poor this season. They had so many opportunities to catch the teams above them this season, and don't get me wrong, at times I do think that players have let him down, especially in an attacking sense, but judging off the results in the second half of the season, it's tough to put him all too much higher, I think. Blackburn Rovers' Tony Mowbray up next. I've made no secrets about this season. I think he's been one of the most underperforming managers this season. It's the Blackburn squad with an abundance of talent in there. You know, they've got one of the best Premier League youngsters in Harvey Elliott in there, supplying one of the best strikers in the league in Adam Armstrong as well. They finally sorted out that goalkeeper issue, getting a decent one in this year in Kaminski. They've got some other decent options all over the field, and yet still, it's been such a poor year for Blackburn after the early signs were also promising for them. Tony Mowbray, I'm saying poor. I honestly don't know if he's the right man anymore to lead Blackburn forward. I feel like they need a managerial change to kick them onto that next edge where they should be at this point. Thomas Frank's an interesting one, isn't he? It's back-to-back third finishes for Brentford, and he certainly deserves credit for how he's bedded Ivan Toney into this team. You know, there was quite a bit of change coming into this season with Brentford losing their two stars from last season in Ben Rama and Ollie Watkins, and they've not really missed either of them, to be honest with you. I think they've got on fine without them, haven't they? Of course, if he wanted to go one better, they would have been pushing Watford a little bit more for automatic promotion in the end. They just had too many draws towards the end of the season, didn't they? But the fact that they're in this situation again in the playoffs, they've got another crack at the Premier League. I think he deserves credit for how he's tinkered with the system a little bit in the second half of the season as well. I'll give him the benefit of the doubt and I'll put him in very good, although the playoffs will probably sway my mind a little bit on that one, depending on how Brentford do. Bristol City's Nigel Pearson, and based on this season, I'm going to have to put him into the poor category. He had that initial sort of burst with them, didn't they? But that quickly fizzled out, and the problems that Bristol City have had this season, I know that they've been up to their neck in injuries and loads of external factors and stuff like that, but if I'm basing this purely off results since Pearson's been in charge for, it's not been great, has it? You know, a 19th place finish for this Bristol City side is pretty poor. Barnsley's Valorant Ishmael comes up next, and without a shadow of a doubt goes into that top elite category for me, and I think probably the manager of the season, you know. I enjoyed reading up on some of the comments from yesterday's video about where everyone sort of predicted Barnsley to finish. You know, I had a bit of a nightmare with them, but the fact that he's been able to take over that team in October and take them to these heights, you know, almost a 60% win record with Barnsley this season is absolutely phenomenal. A lot of people are rooting for them in the playoffs this season, as they are that bit of an underdog after last season's story and everything like that. Without a doubt, he's an elite manager this season. Obviously, Gerhard Struber has also been in charge for Barnsley this season, but I mean, he only had a handful of matches in charge, really, didn't he? So we can't really judge him off this season. Bournemouth's Jonathan Woodgate, I think you have to give him the benefit of the doubt and say he's been pretty good for Bournemouth. I know there were a lot of reservations about him getting the job initially, you know, myself, I had quite a lot of them, but that winning streak that they went on has ultimately got Bournemouth into the top 6 in the end, hasn't it? So once again, probably a prediction or a ranking which will change depending on how Bournemouth go ahead and do in the playoffs, but for the time being, he's done a good job. But guys, there we have it. As you can see on screen now, those are my rankings for Championship managers this season. Get your thoughts down below. Who do you think I've been too harsh on, and who have I been too kind to? Let me know down below. But apart from that, that will now wrap it up for today's video, guys. So thank you very much for watching. If you did go in to enjoy, as always, make sure to leave a like, do subscribe for a bit of regular Championship content, and check out the Patreon. Link to that is down below. But other than that, thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you all in the next one.